No matter if you love Ninja Gaiden as a side-scrolling action game or a fully 3D brawler, this has been a great year for those who grew up loving Ryu Hayabusa. To help celebrate this week's long-awaited release of Ninja Gaiden IV, I thought it might be fun to see what the critics said about the classic games that were released on everything from the Nintendo Entertainment System, to the Lynx, to the old-school Xbox. We're going to be going through the entire franchise, including the classic 8-bit trilogy, the 3D reboot series, the portable spin-offs, and even that weird Ninja Gaiden remake that was only out on the PC Engine. That's 15 games, all of which to figure out which Ninja Gaiden game comes out on top. To answer that question, I decided to flip through the pages of Electronic Gaming Monthly, Nintendo Power, GamePro, Computer and Video Games, and more classic magazines that reviewed these games back when they first came out. Grab those demon statues and pull off your best 10-hit combos, because you're gonna need them in this supercut episode of Ninja Gaiden Review Crew.
Like a ghost in the moonlight, the ninja warrior stalks his prey. Unseen, unheard, and unnoticed. Mission accomplished. The final battle begins. Ninja Gaiden for Nintendo from Tecmo. Coming soon, more hard-to-beat action. Tecmo Bad News Baseball.
For gamers of a certain age, Ninja Gaiden on the Nintendo Entertainment System was nothing short of a revelation. In an era when a game's plot was usually limited to an instruction manual, Ninja Gaiden bucked that trend by giving us an action platformer with cinematic cutscenes that told a surprisingly deep and emotional story. Well, certainly primitive by today's standards. These cinemas were absolutely incredible, and they actually made you care about the characters like never before. Of course, it certainly didn't hurt that the actual ninja action was a whole lot of fun. Between the excellent story, the amazing presentation, and the hard-boiled action, Ninja Gaiden went on to become one of the best 8-bit trilogies of all time. Let's see if the critics agreed when they reviewed the first Ninja Gaiden. The one thing that you need to know about this game is that it came out in 1989, back at a time when there weren't a whole lot of magazines reviewing games. As such, we aren't going to get the usual takes from Electronic Gaming Monthly or GamePro. Instead, we're going to turn to Mean Machines, which gave the game a strong score of 88%. Julian argued that Ninja Gaiden is very much a simplified version of the Shadow Warriors coin-op, with the hero running around beating the 7 shades out of the baddies and using the backdrop to climb and leap to seemingly inaccessible parts of the screen. The graphics are great, with varied, well-drawn backdrops and some great sprites. The sound doesn't quite match the standards of the graphics, but what's there is atmospheric and it suits the action. It seems pretty tough at first, but once you get used to the combat moves, you'll find yourself cutting a swath through the enemy, swords and shurikens flying. Ninja Gaiden is a thoroughly enjoyable beat-em-up that is highly recommended for combat fans. Ray's also liked the game, giving this NES title a high score of 90%. Yeah, that's cool and all, but the magazine that I actually want to draw your attention to is Game Informer, which actually gave Ninja Gaiden the lowest score. Reviewed just a few years after the first release, the 3 Game Informer editors were less than excited about revisiting this 8-bit classic. Paul, the pro player, gave the game a 5 out of 10, noting that when the game first came out, I assumed that it was the arcade translation. Wrong! Since then, I felt that the 8-bit version was lame. The arcade version is awesome, and this isn't even close. I guess I'm still bitter, so I'll leave this version in the attic and play the real arcade version on the Lynx. Ross, the rebel gamer, liked the game a little bit more, giving it a 7.25 out of 10. The cinemas between levels have yet to be topped by any NES game. The one problem this game has is its playability. The main character is a ninja trained in both martial arts and assassination, who should be virtually unstoppable. Unfortunately, that invincible quality doesn't come through. With an average score of 6.5 out of 10, Game Informer was not impressed with Ninja Gaiden. While Electronic Gaming Monthly didn't review this game back in 1989, they did give it an award in their 5th issue, naming it the best ending in a video game. EGM argued that with super graphics detailing an equally outstanding storyline, the climax to Ninja Gaiden is better than some movies we've seen recently. Not only does the game explain many of the mysterious secrets, it also leaves the door open for Part 2, which is coming next year. Outside of that award, there aren't many other reviews, and that's a shame. It would have been great to see if others agreed with Ross and Paul at Game Informer, or if they were more in line with Julian at Mean Machines. I guess we'll just have to wait for the sequel to find out what the other critics thought of the Ninja Gaiden series. One year after Ninja Gaiden laid the groundwork for a future filled with cinematic video games, the sequel arrived with more of what made the first game so damn good. I'm talking about bigger levels, better power-ups, more cinemas, and a story that somehow topped the original. It introduces some of the franchise's best characters and gives us an even worse baddie to contend with. It hints at a more complicated power struggle between the villains, and has one of the greatest endings of all time. This truly was the sequel that fans had been waiting for, but were the critics impressed? Let's go ahead and start with Electronic Gaming Monthly, who opted not to review the first game back in 1989. Ed gushed that The Dark Sword of Chaos is probably the best sequel ever made, with near-perfect graphics, challenging gameplay, and intermissions which entice you to always go round further. Other than the difficult gameplay and higher levels, Ninja Gaiden 2 is as good as an action game can get. Oddly enough, the only EGM critic to not give the game a 9 out of 10 was their own resident ninja Sushi X. There's no denying the fact that Ninja Gaiden 2 is a superb game. It outdoes the original in nearly every department. It's addictive, and the intermissions and story are terrific. Using the same bosses that were in the first game is a letdown, but it's still worth the price of admission. EGM gave Ninja Gaiden 2 an average score of 8.75 out of 10. Now, would you believe that EGM's score actually put them at the bottom of the review scale? It's true, the reviews only go up from here. For example, Video Games and Computer Entertainment gave Ninja Gaiden 2 a score of 9 out of 10 in their 17th issue. Titles like Ninja Gaiden are proof that video games are learning how to evoke players' emotions and entertain just like a movie or TV show can. These adventures go beyond the confines of video game gimmickry. In fact, I wouldn't hesitate to call it a legitimate art form. That may be a lofty position for game designers to aspire to, particularly since the average NES owner is not yet in high school. But quality doesn't hurt, and Tecmo knows it. Ninja Gaiden 2 is a winner, and it's got my vote for one of the best NES carts ever. Highly recommended. If you're curious who gave Ninja Gaiden 2 the highest grade, that magazine was Nintendo Power, who went all the way up to a 4.7 out of 5. That makes it the second best reviewed game of 1990, right behind Castlevania 3. Unfortunately, this was an era of Nintendo Power where they didn't actually publish a written review with their scores, so we're never gonna know what made them go that high. Instead, I'd like to point out that Game Players magazine ended up giving the game an award for NES excellence, while it earned Electronic Gaming Monthly's Best Ending in a Game award in their 15th issue. While there may not be a lot of reviews, the few that covered Ninja Gaiden 2 loved it. I mean, just look at the way that Video Games and Computer Entertainment covered it, practically comparing it to the Mona Lisa or Citizen Kane. It's really the beginning of critics making the argument that video games are more than just a children's toy. With an average score of 91%, this truly was one of the best reviewed games on the Nintendo Entertainment System, and one of the greatest sequels ever made.
全ては戦いの序曲だ。動き始めた闇の魔力はもう誰にも止められない。さらに 集めさらに激しく今開く闇の扉忍者龍剣伝2暗黒の邪神剣戦い極まるテクモ。
The third and final game in the original 8-bit trilogy is Ninja Gaiden III, the Ancient Ship of Doom, a prequel that fills in some of the lore between the first and the second game, all while complicating things with plot holes and contradictions. Of course, the fans didn't care because they still got the fast-paced levels, the exciting boss fights, and even more impressive cinema sequences. Of the three NES games, this one is often cited as the weakest link, though I would certainly argue that this is still a lot of fun to play. How did the critics view the Ancient Ship of Doom back in 1991? Let's find out. We're going to once again start with Electronic Gaming Monthly, which gave yet another Ninja Gaiden game a high score. This time, it was an average of 8 out of 10, down slightly from the 8.75 they gave the middle chapter. While the score was down, the enthusiasm was actually up. Martin called this a player's game. Only 3 continues makes this the perfect cart for those who've mastered the first 2 carts. Warning, this is a high-stress cart, not recommended for wimpy gamers. It boasts great graphics and cool music, although the cinemas are kinda cheesy. Steve agreed, arguing that this has to be the best of the Gaiden series. The Ancient Ship of Doom makes up for both the lack of difficulty and the awkward control that kept the previous Gaiden games from being full 10s. The theme has worn a little thin, but the action, sound, and graphics are still top-notch. Wait, hang on. Did he just say that the first 2 Ninja Gaiden games were too easy? Boy, that is not my recollection of those games. As we slide down the review scale, we see Nintendo Power give the game a 3.9 out of 5 in their 27th issue. They would later award the game Best Challenge, which is certainly deserved. For what it's worth, the lowest score comes from Video Games and Computer Entertainment, which went from giving the second game a 9 to giving the final installment a 7. This is the third time around for Ninja Gaiden, and this new edition's gameplay is as fast and furious as its predecessor. If you've played the first 2 chapters of the ever-popular story of Ryu and Irene, you'll feel right at home leaping, spinning, climbing, and blasting your way through the 7 levels that make up Ninja Gaiden 3. All in all, Ninja Gaiden 3 is more of the high-quality jump and shoot ninja action that the first 2 games were famous for. Its gameplay is simple enough to get novices started quickly, but challenging enough for even ninja gurus. Recommended! Now if we flip to the other side of the scale, we see GamePro swoop in and give the Ancient Ship of Doom a perfect score of 5 out of 5. This was not their first review of the Ninja Gaiden series, but it was the first one to earn a score. If you like ninja fighting, then this is a no-brainer. Go for it. Even the sound's right above average for Ryu's Hayabusa alone. Tecmo hints that this is the final chapter for NES Ninja Gaiden. But before you run out and commit seppuku, consider this. Maybe ending Ninja Gaiden is okay. Maybe Ryu should finally hang up his sword and find peace. Maybe Irene should enjoy life instead of always losing it. Maybe Ashtar should just chill out. Nah! The rumors were true. This would end up being the final installment in the NES trilogy, but not the last that we've heard of Ryu in the Ninja Gaiden franchise. 14 years later, Tecmo rebooted the series on Xbox, where it received a number of sequels and spin-offs. Now we're going to cover those in a future episode, along with the Super NES compilation, the Lynx port of the arcade game, and some other Ninja Gaiden releases over the years. Let me tell you, we still have a whole lot of Ninja Gaidening to do between now and the release of Ragebound. For many gamers, their first exposure to the Ninja Gaiden franchise was through the 1988 arcade game. This was a side-scrolling beat-em-up that was in the spirit of games like Double Dragon and Final Fight, only now with a ninja hero who's surprisingly nimble. It also had one of the most gruesome game over screens of all time, something that really helped to set it apart from all the other brawlers in the arcade. While that specific version of Ninja Gaiden never made its way to the Nintendo Entertainment System, it did eventually land on the Atari Lynx in 1991. Although corners were cut to get it to fit on the handheld, this is a more or less faithful translation of the 1988 beat-em-up. Lynx owners were excited to have yet another high-profile game on their fledgling system. What did the critics say? Now, if you watched the first episode of Ninja Gaiden Review Crew, then you already know that Electronic Gaming Monthly liked both Ninja Gaiden 2 and 3 on the Nintendo Entertainment System. As it turns out, they also liked Ninja Gaiden on the Lynx, with Steve calling it an excellent conversion of an excellent game. Ninja Gaiden hits the mark on all counts. There are lots of good moves, and the scrolling is very smooth. Like Warbirds, this shows what the Lynx is capable of, even with its small screen. One of the best Lynx games produced. Sushi X agreed. Nice job, dudes. The Ninja Gaiden coin-op never looked better. Well, maybe a little. Anyway, this is still a marvelous job done bringing home one of the most popular arcade games of all time. How they got it all onto a little Lynx card is beyond me. Keep 'em coming. EGM gave Ninja Gaiden an average score of 8 out of 10. That score is right in line with the 4 out of 5 that we saw GamePro give the game in their 25th issue. For what it's worth, the lowest score comes from A's, but seeing as they employ a ridiculous 1,000 point scale, it's also kind of the highest score. Giving Ninja Gaiden a score of 715, they concluded that, oh, it's a beat-em-up alright, but surprise, surprise, it takes place in an urban setting. The catsuit-clad hero must negotiate the mean streets, taking out the homicidal maniacs who besiege him from every direction, with the ultimate aim of finding and slaying a fellow ninja possessed by a demon. In the game's favor, the ninja has some novel moves at his disposal. Extra weapons and power-ups can be found inside the wreckage of smashed telephone booths and packing crates, and the bizarre bunch of foes range from masked thugs to log-wielding fat men. But despite that, there's nothing here to shake you from the ennui-induced lethargy of seeing yet another ninja game. Moving back up the scale, we see that GameZone more or less agreed with the consensus, giving the arcade port a solid 83%. The highest score actually comes from Computer and Video Games, who ended up giving Ninja Gaiden a fantastic score of 89%. For the Lynx's first beat-em-up, Ninja Gaiden is a little short of superb, and really addictive too. An excellent title, and one which any self-respecting Lynx owner should race out and shell out for at once. And you know what? I agree. While it's true that I prefer the NES games over the arcade original, there's no denying that this is a great port and one of the early standouts for the Lynx. With an overall average of 81%, pretty much everybody agreed that this is yet another winner under Ryu Hayabusa's black belt.
Out of the darkness, the bright spirit of the Ryukenden reborn. Ninja Ryukenden from Tecmo. Just when you had given up all hope, a ninja saves you from the evil Jackie O. More realistic than any other TV game, you're right in the action, fighting to the death. Coming soon from Tecmo, Ninja Ryukenden, incredible game software for Famicom.
1991 was a big year for Ryu Hayabusa. This was the year that not only brought us Ninja Gaiden IV, the Ancient Ship of Doom, Ninja Gaiden Shadow on the Game Boy, and of course the Lynx version of the arcade brawler, but Sega fans also got their taste in Ninja Gaiden with a completely different Game Gear game. Although visually similar to the side-scrolling NES Trilogy, this is a whole new game complete with a different story and a bunch of new cinema scenes. It's actually a pretty slick package that's been mostly overshadowed by the more popular NES games. Let's see what the critics said. Published in the exact same issue that saw a review of the Ancient Ship of Doom, Electronic Gaming Monthly wasn't excited about Ninja Gaiden on the Game Gear. Giving it an average score of 6.75 out of 10, this was seen as Ryu's one misadventure. Steve complained that this game has an awkward look and style that reminds me more of Strider than Ninja Gaiden, That point aside, Ninja Gaiden for the Game Gear is a nice addition to the portable's growing list of action carts. But it still comes up short on gameplay and, in some areas, graphics. Martin liked the game a little bit more, but agreed with the comparison. This cart is just Strider with a stronger license, namely the mega popular NES hit. What's the matter, Sega? Don't you have any faith in your own titles? Good graphics and gameplay make this one of the better Game Gear carts. The game is too easy and the password was not needed. While EGM score wasn't the lowest, it might as well be, as GamePro gave the action cart a so-so 3 out of 5. Moving up the scale, we see Sega Force giving the game a 71% in their very first issue, which is the same score that Sega Pro gave the title in their third issue. Game Zone, on the other hand, went a few ticks higher, giving the game a 74%. The key word really is ninja rather than Gaiden. This is an attractive, if fairly standard, horizontal scrolling ninja beat-em-up. This means that it's all fairly standard ninja fare, but none too bad for all that. The action is smooth and colorful, as are the backdrops. The main sprite animation is okay, and the ninja is able to execute the usual range of whirls, twirls, and wall scaling for which the hooded ones are famous. Reasonable though it is, the Game Gear's Ninja Gaiden isn't a patch on the Lynx game of the same name. Good, but not special. As we continue our trek looking for those higher scores, we see Ace once again employ their ridiculous 1,000 point scale, giving Ninja Gaiden an easy to understand 800. That's right, just 800, on the dot. That's interesting, I suppose, but the highest score actually comes from Sega Power. They praised the great graphics, good soundtrack, clever game design, and short length, but also complained that it's too short. Go figure. A great hack-em-up that just manages to survive on the Game Gear's limited display. Solid, frantic action that'll keep you hooked, but probably not for very long because you'll have finished it by then. If you liked GG Shinobi, then you'll love this one. While not quite on the same level as the NES Trilogy, or even the Lynx game for that matter, the reviews paint this Game Gear title as a good but flawed action game that's a little bit more like Strider than Ninja Gaiden. With an overall average of 72%, many critics gave this Sega-published entry a tepid recommendation. While it may have the Ninja Gaiden name, and may even star Ryu Hayabusa, make no mistake about it, this Game Boy spin-off started its life as a portable version of Shadow of the Ninja. You can certainly see that in its name, Ninja Gaiden Shadow, as well as the level designs and even the gameplay, which takes a lot of its cues from the 1990 Natsumi game. And you know what? There's a good reason for that. Because this Ninja Gaiden spin-off was actually developed by the same team that brought you Shadow of the Ninja, making it a really fun hybrid, no matter which ninja franchise you preferred. But hey, what did the critics say all those years ago? Did they mind that it wasn't a proper Ninja Gaiden sequel? Of all the magazines that reviewed Ninja Gaiden Shadow, only Video Games and Computer Entertainment brought up the connection to Shadow of the Ninja. I actually like the way that they handled it in their review. Ryu Hayabusa's first appearance on the Game Boy is called Ninja Gaiden Shadow because it was created by Natsumi as a portable version of its NES hit Shadow of the Ninja. A little tweaking, a new introductory sequence, and a title change were all it took to convert Natsumi's efforts into Tecmo's latest martial arts masterpiece. Aside from the missing intermissions, you won't hear any complaints from me. In some ways, Shadow of the Ninja could be considered a better game than the original Ninja Gaiden. They concluded that detailed graphics, realistic animation, a throbbing musical score, nasty boss characters, and satisfying gameplay have been the hallmark of the Ninja Gaiden series to date. And Ninja Gaiden Shadow has no problem meeting any of those criteria. Video Games and Computer Entertainment gave the game an 8 out of 10. Now, for what it's worth, not every magazine was as won over by the palette swapping. For example, you saw Nintendo Power give the game a 3.7 out of 5. GamePro went even lower, giving the game a surprising score of 3 out of 5. concluding that video game ninja masters will note that although Ninja Gaiden Shadow closely resembles the NES games, it doesn't live up to the standard in length or challenge. However, the crisp, authentic graphics and that old black ninja magic make this a good cart for ninja wannabes and a nice afternoon's diversion for hardcore Ryu fans. Naysayers aside, most of the critics love Ninja Gaiden Shadow. You saw Ace ditch their usual and ridiculous 1,000 point scale to give the Game Boy game a 4 out of 5. Computer and video game offshoot Go liked it even more, giving it a high score of 90%. In fact, Paul Rand was nearly out of breath when he reviewed it for the magazine's 8th issue. Phew! Ninja Gaiden Shadow is a furious frenzy from start to finish. You'll go glassy-eyed over the graphics, slaver over the sound, and pop a cork over the playability. A brilliant beat-em-up worthy of anyone's time and money. While I prefer both the NES version of Ninja Gaiden and Shadow of the Ninja over this hybrid game, I would still argue that this Game Boy title is well worth playing. It's one of the better action games on the handheld. With an overall average of 76%, Ninja Gaiden Shadow rates higher than the Game Gear game, yet a bit lower than the Lynx port. Not a terrible place to be.
You gonna buy the same old game, boy?
Atari Lynx, the portable video arcade. Lynx, so packed with action. Racked with attraction. Stacked with more games for total satisfaction. It'll blow you away. Lynx, more fun and games from Atari.
If you're one of those people who loved the Ninja Gaiden trilogy on the Nintendo Entertainment System and always wanted another installment, then let me introduce you to Ninja Gaiden on the Sega Master System. While it doesn't exactly continue the story of the NES trilogy, it comes close enough and gives Ryu Hayabusa another amazing side-scrolling adventure to conquer. Not only was this game released exclusively on the Master System in 1992, but it was also never released in the United States, so there's a real good chance that a lot of you out there never played this hidden gem. Let's go ahead and take a trip across the pond and see what the critics said about the Master System version of Ninja Gaiden. When it comes to the reviews, almost everybody was on the same page, giving Ninja Gaiden scores in the 80% to 90% range. Now I say almost because there was one big outlier, and that's Sega Power. They went all the way down to a 53%, so I figured that we might as well just get that review out of the way and then focus on the rest of the bunch. Sega Power praised the 8 long levels, the variety of weapons, and for some reason the lack of moves, yet complained about the graphics and the empty space in each level and that there are parts that are too easy and too hard. Looking for an excellent fighting platform game? Well, keep looking. This game doesn't cut the mustard. The sprites are too small, the gameplay's lacking, and it's dead tough. Now, as I mentioned a moment ago, Sega Power was the real outlier when it came to Ninja Gaiden. In fact, the next lowest score comes to us from Mean Machines, and it's a full 30 points higher. Giving it an 83%, Rob argued that decent platform games have been a bit scarce on the Master System recently. Ninja Gaiden more than makes up for the relapse. It boasts excellent graphics, full of color with a detailed attention to the backdrops. I was also impressed by the animation, which, like Prince of Persia, manages to fulfill its potential. While Ninja Gaiden doesn't have much in the way of new ideas, it does prove very successful with the old ones. And it's this fact that makes the game well worth a look. Moving on up that scale, we see GameZone champion the game with an 86%, while Sega Master Force went all the way up to a 90%. Wow, that's the same score that we saw from the similarly named Sega Force. Wade through the multitude of opening screens on this one, and you'll find a real belter of a platform romp. The scenario's uninspired, but that doesn't matter when the gameplay is so smooth. Who cares about sacred scrolls? Just get out there and start dishing out death. Ninja Gaiden's great to look at, the music and in-game effects are nicely atmospheric, and above all, the controls work a treat. Jump up to a branch or across the ravines and Ryu holds on and sticks where you want him to without any fuss. If you're a ninja freak, you gotta get a hold of this one quick. And even if you're not, Ninja Gaiden's got a whole lot to offer. Look, maybe it's because it came out a little bit later or was stuck on the Sega Master System, but I'm honestly a little bit surprised that more people haven't discovered the greatness of this version of Ninja Gaiden. It tells its own story with new levels and an adventure that honestly I'd put above Ninja Gaiden 3 on the NES. And with an overall average of 80%, the critics agreed. This is a good Ninja Gaiden game. Chances are that you played through the original Ninja Gaiden trilogy on the Nintendo Entertainment System. But did you know that Ryu's 8-bit adventures found their way to other consoles? A great example of this is the PC Engine port of the Japanese original, Ninja Ryukenden. It's a better looking and more colorful take that never made its way west, but was in several English language magazines. Let's go ahead and see what they thought of this 1992 port. Now, with only 3 different magazines to pull reviews from, I want to start at the very bottom and work our way up. This gives us a chance to introduce a new magazine to the review crew, the British publication Games X. This is yet another magazine with one of those dumb scoring systems, but we're going to get to that in a moment. Let's first see what they said about this game. Yawn! Another version of Ninja Gaiden. Well, what can I say? The PC Engine version is pretty good, but as you'd expect, it doesn't break any new barriers in terms of originality or graphical excellence. Nevertheless, the control system works well and the presentation is okay, so if you're looking for a run-of-the-mill beat-em-up on the engine, then you can do a lot worse than Ninja Gaiden. Now, using their patented X rating system, yes, that is what they chose to call it, this game earns a score of 3 X's out of 5, or triple, well, you get the idea. Even with a limited sample size, Games X was definitely in the minority. Die Hard Game Fan gave this TurboGrafx import an average of 85%, while Computer and Video Games went even higher with a solid 89%. Frank O'Connor concluded that the PC Engine has a whole load of fabby platform-related beat-em-ups, but this is sufficiently different to merit a further look. This is a truly abominable piece of programming. As the foreground smoothly slides by, the background judders and shakes its way past. The music is remarkably unspectacular for the otherwise funky engine, but the chop-socky tunes suit the game well enough. The clever climbing abilities of your ninja sprite are ruined a bit by the iffy control method, but it's not too bad. There's no doubt that this is playable. It's great fun and very, very difficult. The frustration builds, but it only makes you want another go. Buy it if you're after a shinobi-style romp, but fans of the arcade game will be gravely disappointed. What I find interesting about these reviews is how they talk about everything but the deep story and lengthy cinemas. I mean, those are the things that separate this game from Shinobi, yet the critics seem a lot more annoyed that they aren't playing the less memorable arcade game. With an overall average of 78%, the critics still recommend this version of Ninja Gaiden, but it definitely sounds like it could have been a whole lot better.
Tiger puts arcade action in the palm of your hand. Games like Ninja Gaiden. As the ultimate ninja, use your spin, jump, and fire wheel to destroy your enemies. But watch out, you must pick up the red power boost that will keep you alive through 9 levels of action. Also available, Tiger's Ninja Gaiden wrist game for the time of your life. Tiger LCD video games. Video excitement in the palm of your hand.
When Ninja Gaiden was first released on the Lynx back in 1991, it was a port of the arcade beat-em-up, a completely different game than what we got on the Nintendo Entertainment System. This was followed up 2 years later by a port of Ninja Gaiden 3, The Ancient Ship of Doom? That's right, for some reason that I've never been able to understand, despite the lack of the first two games on the system, Tecmo just decided to bring the third and final chapter of the NES Trilogy to the Lynx. Now, to their credit, of the 3 games in the Trilogy, this is the one with the most standalone story. Plus, the game really does shine on the Lynx's color screen. Let's go ahead and see if the critics were able to wrap their heads around this questionable port. We're going to kick things off with Electronic Gaming Monthly, which means that we're going to start at the very bottom of the barrel when it comes to the review scores. Giving it an average of 6.5 out of 10, EGM had some real issues with this port. Al argued that Ninja Gaiden is the game that the Atari Lynx has been longing for. Like its Nintendo counterpart, Ninja Gaiden has great gameplay that exceeds many of the other action games in the genre. The sound, although 8-bit, is okay and gets the player hyped. The problem I run into is the small characters. They're so small that you can't tell where you are sometimes. Anyone with the Lynx should pick this up. Ed liked it a bit more, giving it an 8 out of 10 and noting that Ninja Gaiden plays a lot like the NES Classic. The game plays especially well for the small screen. The blurring inherent with the system is pretty bad, particularly because your character is so small. The magic is really easy to use and it helps out tremendously. Ninja Gaiden is a good title to pick up if you have a Lynx. If you can bear the blurring, you'll be in for a real treat. Games like this don't come out often. With EGM pulling up the rear, the scores can only get better. Video Games and Computer Entertainment ended up giving the game a 7 out of 10, the exact same score they gave the NES version. GamePro went a bit higher, giving the Ancient Ship of Doom a score of 4 out of 5. If you're an action gamer who doesn't like Ninja Gaiden, then you belong in the video game nerd house. However, this version adds eye strain and nerve-twinging challenge to wither the will of even the most determined Gaiden followers. Oh please, don't let it end here. Well, and here it ends. Well, sort of, for a while. Whether on the Lynx or for the NES, Ninja Gaiden 3 is the weakest entry on every platform. That said, it is still worth playing. This handheld version isn't the way to go, but it is cool that it exists. Now let's go ahead and quickly move on to Ninja Gaiden 3 on another system, this time the Super NES. After leaving the NES trilogy on something of a high note with the Ancient Ship of Doom, many Ninja Gaiden fans figured that Tecmo would reinvent the franchise on the 16-bit consoles. But that was not the case. The only Ninja Gaiden game to hit the Super NES was this compilation of the NES trilogy, appropriately called Ninja Gaiden Trilogy. Now, unlike Super Mario All-Stars, the 3 games here were straight ports visually, though there were some minor changes made to each of the titles. Before we go into the reviews, it's important to remember that this compilation was released in August of 1995. That's 4 years after the series wrapped up on the NES, and just days before the looming 32-bit console war. Just keep that in the back of your mind as we dig into these reviews. Historically, Electronic Gaming Monthly was almost always a fan of Ninja Gaiden. This was especially true of the NES trilogy. The lowest score they gave the series was an 8 out of 10, and only going lower when it was ported to the Lynx. But that was then, and this is 1995. With an average score of 6.9 out of 10, it's clear that most of the EGM editors were starting to turn on the Tecmo series. Dano summed up the frustration perfectly. 3 games in 1 cartridge? And there's no change to the graphics or music? Who thought this one up? The Ninja Gaiden Trilogy is a unique idea, but Tecmo really should have enhanced the looks to improve it. Ed, on the other hand, was the lone critic to actually recommend the game. I must admit that I was wishing that Tecmo would have improved the graphics, but after a trip down memory lane, I was hooked back on one of my favorite series. The action is just as intense as ever, and the music is sweet. The cinemas have been redrawn as well. The effect of the new graphics will make you drool. If only Tecmo worked on the rest of the game. 3 games in 1 cart is a great deal. For those of you who missed out, try playing these classics. Now before we climb up the scale, let's first check in with Nintendo Power, who gave the Ninja Gaiden Trilogy a 3 out of 5. They liked the great action and game design, specifically noting the challenge and the passwords. However, they complained that the original controller setup seems a bit awkward on the Super NES controller. No new features, except for the passwords, and the graphics don't live up to the current Super NES standards. Now I will point out that this is a compilation of classic games, not a remake, but I guess that distinction wasn't a thing back in 1995. If we go back over the Electronic Gaming Monthly divide, we find GamePro giving Ninja Gaiden Trilogy its highest marks, a 4.5 out of 5. After firing up this game, one can only wonder why Tecmo chose not to do Gaiden in a 16-bit format. At least for now, Ryu wannabes can revive some ninja fighting skills and take heart in rampant rumors of a Ninja Gaiden for the next generation systems. Well, I hate to be the bearer of bad news, GamePro, but those rampant rumors about Ninja Gaiden coming to the next generation systems are, well, they're wrong. It's more like the next generation. Basically a full decade after this review. I know what your next question is going to be, and that's what did the critics think about the 3D Reboot series? Well, we're going to answer that next time on Ninja Gaiden Review Crew.
From the makers of Dead or Alive comes the greatest action game of all time, Ninja Gaiden. Rated M for mature. Unleash your inner ninja.
Oh, I'll take a pound of that.
Xbox, it's good to play together.
After the commercial success of the Ninja Gaiden trilogy on the Nintendo Entertainment System, many expected that Tecmo would give Ryu Hayabusa a 16-bit makeover on the Super NES. But that did not happen. We also didn't get a 32-bit sequel, though Ryu did find his way into the Dead or Alive fighting franchise. In a move that frustrated fans from around the world, Tecmo decided to wait until 2004 to reboot the series on the Xbox. That's a 12-year gap between releases. Now let me tell you, the hype was real. This was more than just a brand new game from a beloved franchise, but it was also one of the most important console exclusives on the original Xbox. This game was a big deal, and the critics expected big things from this long overdue installment. But did it live up to those lofty expectations? Yes, absolutely. Of course it did. This is one of those games where the range in score goes from 90% all the way up to a perfect 100%. As you're going to find as we hone into Electronic Gaming Monthly, who sits right in the middle with an average score of 9.5 out of 10. Shane gushed that it's as good as you hoped it would be. Hell, it's actually better. With one stylish katana slash, Ninja Gaiden slashes its way to the top of the action genre. And it's not all about graphics. Well, okay, it is, in part. It's tough to even find fault in such a polished game, but I did suffer a few unnecessary deaths due to the occasional obtuse camera angles. Also, too many of the puzzles follow the absurd find the handle to turn the crank mold. Regardless, this is an unmissable instant classic that completely deserves your time and money. CJ agreed. Merriam-Webster, it's time to revisit the entry for Kick-Ass and tack on also see Ninja Gaiden. The visuals strike the first blow, but the minute you decide to stop smelling the flowers and strike back, you begin to see that it isn't just a pretty picture. Gaiden's gameplay is equally well crafted, with responsive controls that demand fighting game caliber reflexes. It's nail-bitingly tough, but it's extremely rewarding since it forces you to hone your ninja skills. The game's only flaw is the lame duck camera, which makes battling groups of enemies more difficult than it should be. Even so, no Xbox should go without Gaiden. Now, if you want to see the so-called low score, then, well, you might be disappointed. Computer and Video Games went a little bit lower than EGM, giving the reboot a 9.3 out of 10. And then there's just a massive pileup, with the rest of the magazines giving Ninja Gaiden a 9 out of 10. That's the score that GMR gave the game in their 16th issue, as well as Xbox Nation in their 19th. Edge also went in with a 9 out of 10, summing it up this way. To applaud Ninja Gaiden for being hard is to miss the point, not least because there are portions of the game that aren't. The point is that the fluidity of movement that felt so groundbreaking in Prince of Persia only a few months ago is something that Gaiden supplies with almost contemptuous ease. The point is the dozens of things that are done so well that you don't even notice them happening. The perfectly judged auto-aim, the sound design packed with information and atmosphere. The point is that while it could be argued that no game has the right to demand of you what Gaiden does, few other games offer such exceptional riches in return. Moving back up the scale, we see Game Informer agree with Electronic Gaming Monthly's 9.5 out of 10, the official Xbox magazine went a tick higher, giving it a 9.6 out of 10, and then there's GamePro, who does the most GamePro thing ever, and that's give it a perfect 5 out of 5. Highly skilled players may be able to finish the game quicker, but the majority of folks will clock in for a 20+ hour thrill ride. Few games are this good for so long and keep you coming back for more. Ninja Gaiden is truly outstanding. While it might not command the same goodwill these days, Ninja Gaiden was a genuine force when it was released in 2004. With an overall average of 94%, that puts this 3D reboot in the same category as games like Halo and Ocarina of Time. That also makes it the highest scoring Ninja Gaiden game, at least so far. Let's see if Ninja Gaiden Dragon Sword can top that. After earning high scores on the Game Boy, Game Gear, and even the Lynx, Ninja Gaiden didn't return to a handheld console until 2008 with the release of Dragon Sword on the Nintendo DS. Set somewhere between the first and second entries in the reboot timeline, this was a 3D action game that used the system's unique capabilities to craft a Ninja Gaiden game that was like no other. You see, this is a game that didn't just use the dual screen setup, we actually had to turn the system on its side and then tap on the screen to take out the enemies. It's really the kind of game that could only exist on the DS. Let's see if that had any impact on the scores. Now, instead of starting with Electronic Gaming Monthly like we so often do, let's shake things up a little bit by going to the bottom of the scale and checking in with Edge, who gave Dragon Sword a solid score of 7 out of 10. They were impressed that it used the console's touchscreen in a unique way, but argued that it's not quite sublime. It loves to defy expectations of a handheld title, loading itself with all the moves, magic powers, and textures of the console game, retaining even things it could really do without. Some of its larger fiends delight in lunging, taking you down and molesting you for a few seconds, savaging the game's hard-fought rhythm. And it's tough. Its learning curve almost flat, but its difficulty curve exponential, the wave of enemies growing larger and more frequent between checkpoints. In the meantime, though, it at least makes time for some jocular microphone action and dialogue, proving that if there's a gossamer thin line between gimmick and game on DS, Nintendo isn't alone in seeing it. This is Team Ninja's finest, most intelligent game since Ninja Gaiden Black. It leaves high hopes for the imminent 360 sequel. Moving on up the scale, we see Game Informer give the side story a solid 7.75 out of 10, while GamePro went a bit higher, giving the game a 4 out of 5. Team Ninja is known for making games that really test the limits of a system's hardware, and Dragon Sword is no exception. As a standalone DS game, Ninja Gaiden Dragon Sword is an amazing adventure, almost at the level of The Legend of Zelda Phantom Hourglass. While Dragon Sword's light is diminished by the shadow of the near-perfect console counterpart, it's still a perfect way to help pass the time until Ninja Gaiden 2 arrives. On the top of the pile, we have Nintendo Power, who gave this DS game a very strong 8.5 out of 10, and then there's also Maxim Magazine that gave it a perfect 5 out of 5. But seriously, who cares what Maxim has to say? Let's go ahead and check in with Electronic Gaming Monthly, who gave Dragon Sword an average score of B+. Matt explained that Dragon Sword is too good. Somehow, Team Ninja removed the series' hardcore barrier without making the game overly easy and created controls as polished as they are ballsy. My biggest complaint? Just as the game gets comfortable experimenting with more than slicing up enemies, it ends. If it had more variety and a story that felt less like fan fiction, it'd be competing with console action games. Nick agreed. I agree that it's an impressive accomplishment that Dragon Sword makes the transition with most of its finely tuned ninja luster intact. It's easy to appreciate the speedy, satisfying touchscreen combat, even if it's disappointing to see so much recycling after the novelty wears off. But while the basic mechanics are aces, I found all of the other touchscreen functionality to be stupidly simplistic. It's fun while it lasts though, particularly the boss battles, and will hopefully pave the way for more original DS action. With strong scores across the board, I'm surprised Tecmo didn't continue to experiment with the touchscreen Ninja Gaiden games. And not just on the Nintendo handhelds, but also cell phones and tablets. This really could have been a big series. But alas, it was one and done for Dragon Sword. Honestly, that's a shame, because with an overall average of 84%, it's easily one of the critics' favorite Ninja Gaiden games. Four years after the Ninja Gaiden reboot sliced up the original Xbox, Tomonobu Itagaki was back for the long-awaited sequel, which would also prove to be the final Ninja Gaiden game that he ever worked on. This time, an Xbox 360 exclusive, Ninja Gaiden 2 shakes up the formula by making everything a lot more brutal, with Ryu using his various blades to slice and dice his way through the competition in the most gruesome ways possible. This is a darker and more mature Ryu Hayabusa, and Itagaki hoped that you'd be ready for it. The fans certainly were. What about the critics? After being blown away by the 2004 reboot, I think it's fair to say that the critics were disappointed by Ninja Gaiden 2. Electronic Gaming Monthly, for example, went from giving the first game a near-perfect score to giving the sequel a lowly B rating. Nick praised the attention that was given to tightening up the combat, but has a list of issues a mile long. The awful camera compounds those problems. It drags along behind you like a wounded dog and wanders off on its own when you need it the most. Its puzzles occupy a familiar corner of time wasting, with minimal backtracking to, say, open up a door that you couldn't open 30 seconds ago. Bosses are horribly inconsistent in their difficulty. It's dismaying that these elements are simply brushed aside under the assumption that the combat can support the weight of the entire experience. When things click, it most certainly does. But it's an otherwise inconsistent package with almost as many frustrations as satisfactions. Shane agreed, concluding that more and more, it's apparent that Team Ninja's concept of cool involves marching out a parade of massively endowed doll-like women and rubber-suited monstrosities that Rita Repulsa might have sent against the Power Rangers. But even if these tacky trappings make Ninja Gaiden 2 feel like a guilty pleasure, its refined gameplay warrants a purchase for gamers craving a challenge. As you'd expect, the score took a similar slide over at GamePro, who went from giving the original a perfect 5 out of 5 to giving this game a mere 4 out of 5. The same thing over at Edge, who went from a 9 down to an 8. They complained about the camera and the narrative and the bosses, explaining that taken as a whole, these issues obviously add up. But it's important to emphasize that they never wholly detract from the greatness of the combat. Rightly or wrongly, they're part of the experience. None of this excuses a fundamental fault in design, of course, and one for which Team Ninja, well versed in the Ninja Gaiden franchise, really has no excuse. To win on a negative note would be to do the game a disservice, however. Ninja Gaiden 2 is a fascinating and hugely replayable game that shows Team Ninja has a gift beyond the vast majority of developers in the genre. And it shows something wider. In terms of mainstream video games, and for all that Microsoft needs the support and attach rates of so-called hardcore gamers, the truth is, hardcore gamers need Microsoft more. Much more. Now you're going to notice a trend as we continue to climb up the scale. No matter how high the score is, everybody seems to be a little bit down on Ninja Gaiden 2. There's just an apologetic tone throughout many of the reviews. We see that in the official Xbox Magazine review, where they gave it an 8.5 out of 10, and it even shows up in Game Informer's review, and they're at the top of the list, giving it an 8.75 out of 10. Like a bottle of moonshine in your grandmother's cabinet, whenever the game isn't focusing on the action, it feels like a game from a forgotten era of gaming. Contextual control issues sometimes arise, making it difficult to do simple things, like shimmying along a pipe. The platforming elements, such as running along and climbing walls, can be touchy, and we noticed a few loading issues too. The game still follows the tired pattern of find key A to open locked door B, and the story's about as unnecessary as a tomato fruit roll-up. If you're willing to put up with those few annoyances, Ninja Gaiden will show you a great time, but let's hope that Team Ninja adds a few more flavors to the mix next time it stirs the pot. Oh yeah, don't worry, Team Ninja is definitely going to be changing up the formula in the next game, but you should probably curb your enthusiasm. When it comes to Ninja Gaiden 2, the reviews are definitely down compared to the first game. We've gone from a 94% down to an 83% in just 4 years. And spoiler alert, the free fall is just starting to pick up speed. Yeah, you'll see what I mean. With Itagaki gone and another frustrating 4-year wait, many Ninja Gaiden fans wondered what direction Tecmo would take the series next. In a move that disappointed a lot of the core fans, they decided to make the series a lot more accessible, which meant making the stage designs more linear, simplifying the combat, and adding as many quick-time events as possible. There are just so many. While it certainly still has its defenders, it's clear that these choices angered the fan base and effectively stopped the mainline series dead in its tracks for more than a dozen years. But hey, let's see what the critics thought of Ninja Gaiden 3. Now before we dive into the scores, I want to point out that this is the first Ninja Gaiden game that Electronic Gaming Monthly has failed to review since the very first game. And that was all the way back in 1989. With no EGM to kick around, I guess the next best thing is Game Informer, who gave the sequel a very disappointing 6 out of 10. Ninja Gaiden 3 is not a complete train wreck, but it suffers from a multitude of problems. The action can be fast-paced and engaging at times, but many design decisions significantly bring down the experience. Lacking AI, a limited arsenal, the series' notoriously difficult camera, no inventory currency system, and an incoherent story combine to make this the most disappointing title in the series. For what it's worth, Game Informer's 6 out of 10 was the lowest score of the bunch. The PlayStation Official Magazine UK, for example, went a full point higher, giving it a 7 out of 10. The official Xbox Magazine also had a lot of the same complaints as the other critics, but they did find a way to soften the blow. If all this reads like an evisceration of a horrible game, that's definitely not the case. It's a matter of context. Compared to its predecessors, Ninja Gaiden 3 is a noticeable step back, due largely to the gameplay decisions that are taken out of your hands. Stacked up against its contemporaries, however, it still stands among the finest fast action experiences on the Xbox. Given the rare and tumultuous circumstances that led to such a turnover at Team Ninja, it's fair to wonder what Itagaki's Ninja Gaiden 3 would have been like. Still, this version of Ninja Gaiden 3 is what we get, and it deserves praise for being a great way an Xbox fan can spend $60. It may not live up to the series' impossibly high standards, but it's still a gem in its own right. OXM gave the game a score of 8 out of 10. Look, with even the recommendations sounding a bit tepid, it's clear that the critics were disappointed with this third installment. The overall score was a mere 70%, making this the worst reviewed game of not only the 3D reboots, but of all of the Ninja Gaiden games, including the Game Gear game and that crappy Ninja Gaiden Trilogy on the Super NES. That's the bad news. The good news is that we still have one more game to get to, and it's Yaiba, Ninja Gaiden Z, so, you know, it might not be on the bottom for long.
Ninja Gaiden 2!
After seeing the poor critical and consumer response to Ninja Gaiden 3, Tecmo decided to go in a new direction. Yaiba, Ninja Gaiden Z, is a spin-off that was released in 2014, allowing it to take big chances on not only the gameplay, but also the characters and the setting and everything else. For starters, we're now on Earth 14, a planet that is currently in the middle of a zombie outbreak. This allowed developer Spark Unlimited a chance to make Ninja Gaiden more about the fast-paced gameplay where you're fighting off hordes of enemies in a futuristic world. That's not necessarily a bad idea, but many fans complained that this was just too far removed from the Ninja Gaiden that they knew and loved. Let's see what the critics said. While we've certainly seen review scores dip slightly over the years, this right here is where the Ninja Gaiden series absolutely craters. I mean, even with the worst games in the series, there was always at least one defender. That's not the case when it comes to Yaiba. The highest score you're going to find in an English language magazine is Game Informer, which gave it what I'm going to call an incredibly generous 6.5 out of 10. Battles get increasingly frustrating the deeper you go. Enemies take and dish out a lot of damage, and your starting health bar is small. This, paired with the unreliable counter system and the mid to high tier enemies that rarely get stunned by your attacks, means you're forced to dart around constantly, chipping off a little damage or risking heavy retaliation. When you die, you have to stare at a lengthy load screen and start all the way over at the very first wave, no matter how far you progressed in that arena. Like its second fiddle protagonist, Yaiba in Ninja Gaiden 3 resides in the shadow of many other better third-person action games. But it's not terrible if you're specifically looking for a schlocky Saturday. Like I said, Game Informer looks incredibly generous compared to all the other reviews. For example, the official Xbox magazine ended up giving Yaiba a pitiful score of 4 out of 10. The PlayStation official magazine UK went even lower, giving it a 3. There are bizarre flashes of quality. Yaiba's moveset, some of its voice acting, and the visual design seems to be just visiting from another, better game. But even these wear off on the 20th attempt at the same horrifically designed arena fight. And Yaiba's staggering failure to create a coherent camera, combat finesse, likable characters, interesting levels, or even playable platforming sequences is unforgivable. Yaiba is guilty of the most heinous crime, greeting difficulty not with precision combat, but with myriad borked design calls and some utterly broken camera work. Yeah, that's not exactly a ringing endorsement. This really was the low point for the franchise. And what made it even more frustrating is that it seemed to be the end of the line for Ninja Gaiden. Yaiba was the game that killed the franchise. At least for a decade. Now, 11 years later, Ninja Gaiden is finally back on track, thanks to both Ninja Gaiden Ragebound and Ninja Gaiden 4, proving that it's going to take a lot more than a really bad game to stop the Hayabusa clan. Hey, thanks for watching me break down these classic reviews. If you liked what you saw here, then you should know that we post episodes just like this one every time classic games get added to modern consoles. And you know, sometimes it's when a long-awaited sequel finally comes out, like with Ninja Gaiden. Now, here's the question I have for you. What's your favorite Ninja Gaiden game? Do you go old school, or do you prefer the 3D series? Maybe you're into the Sega published games on the Game Gear and Master System. Or what about the arcade original? Let me see your picks in the comments below. In other news, we're going to be back next week with a Review Crew episode looking at Tekken 3, along with the review of the Angry Video Game Nerd 8-Bit. While you wait for that, I strongly recommend you click that subscribe button and support what we're doing here. Until then.